Hello, and welcome again to Politics and Societies of Southeast Europe. Talking in this second segment about popular culture and culture in Southeast Europe. And in this segment, I want to talk about the popular culture in the 20th century and some of the characteristics of popular culture over the course of the 20th century, and some of the disputes that took place in popular culture and some of the priorities that were associated with popular culture during the 20th century. One thing that I will say at the beginning is that when we're talking about popular culture, the backwardness stereotype that is often imposed on the Balkans does not fit very well. Many of the cultural developments are contemporaneous with developments in the rest of the world. So the first films to be made in the Balkans were made around the same time as the first films in the rest of the world. The pioneers in this were the Menaki brothers. It was a pair of filmmakers. They also had a photo shop who lived in the area that now comprises the southern part of Macedonia, North Macedonia, if you prefer, the northern part of Greece. Among their films is the oldest known recording of a human being. So this is a short film. You can look this up. This film is available online. If I find it within the next few hours, I will post it and put it on the Moodle page to share. I'm not doing embedded videos, although I could in these lectures on culture, simply because I've had too many technical problems trying to embed videos into PowerPoint. But I will try to post some video material for you separately. In any case, cultural development in the field of popular culture, of culture that is available to large-scale markets, so-called mass culture, really develops at around the same pace in Southeast Europe as it does in the rest of Europe. The first feature film to be produced in Southeast Europe, which is a drama, a barely watchable drama. It's terrible, about the rebellion led by Georgia Petrovic, known as Carta Georgia, in 1804, is more or less contemporaneous with the first feature film to be made in France, the film Napoleon by Abel Gance. Uh, we can talk about other developments that are contemporaneous, but really it does not fall behind. So, is popular culture in the region nonetheless distinct from popular culture in other parts of the world? I'd say it enters into an environment and it enters into dialogue with social and political factors that give it some distinguishing characteristics. Uh, so let's uh, so let's talk about culture in especially Yugoslavia over the course of the 20th century. And the first thing that we would say is that the adoption of new cultural technologies, new cultural trends, cultural styles, um, plays a role in the ongoing conflict that is probably the defining conflict structuring all of life in the region over the last couple of hundred years, and that is the conflict for control of cultural, political, social, and economic space between the urban and the rural population under conditions in which the rural population is continually shrinking, the urban population is continually growing, and in conditions in which there are values associated with both rural and urban identity being associated with um, progress, with advancement, with contemporaneousness with the rest of the world. Rural identity being associated with tradition and preservation of values. But the reason that we know about a lot of traditional culture, for example, traditional folk songs from different regions of the Balkans, is that they were recorded using recording technology that at the time was new and was urban. And it's because of this that we have a long record of some of the musical styles that are continue to be most well respected, including the so-called old city songs um, of different cities of the region, particularly Belgrade, Sarajevo, Zagreb, Split, of Sevdalinka, the typically Bosnian style, and so on. So culture enters into this ongoing dialogue between rural and urban identities, and does so in a way that is not entirely associated with one side, and is also not entirely neutral. One of the things that you see about this is, I've given you a slogan here, Svetsko a naše. That is actually an advertising slogan for a brand of beer in Serbia, and you'll forgive me, I don't remember which brand we're talking about. And what that means literally is global but ours. And on both sides, I think what's being made are references to quality. That is, in terms of standards and in terms of contemporaneity and all of that, this is something that is as good as what is available anywhere else in the world, and at the same time, it is ours, also a reference to quality. It is something that carries some of the identity and spirit and uniqueness of the region, and this is a current. I mean, as I say, it's an advertising slogan, but it represents an attitude that is very frequently accompanying cultural production in the region throughout this period. Now, when we move into the communist period, the period of state socialism after 1945 up until around 1990, the promotion of culture is a priority for the state socialist regime. And when we say promotion of culture, that means they're promoting education, they're promoting literacy, and so on. That is, there is an attempt to turn what is principally an agrarian rural population with a low level of education into a population that is predominantly urban and educated to the same level as populations in more prosperous and powerful parts of Europe. And there is also an effort to make culture and cultural production available to all members of the population. So building in cities and towns across the region, theaters, cinemas, libraries, making literature available of different kinds, promoting music and familiarity with music, and so on. There was a goal of creating a cultured population under the slogan. This is a slogan from the first period after the end of the Second World War, Znanje I prosveta biće naša osveta, or literally, knowledge and enlightenment will be our revenge. I think one of the things that this tells you is that the promotion of culture was connected to a set of political purposes. Now, at the same time, we talk about the state socialist regime, but communism, the rule of the Communist Party, Marxist ideology, a lot of things in Yugoslavia were interpreted in ways that were not the same as the way that they were interpreted in other states that had state socialist regimes. This is because of the fact that from the 1950s onward, Yugoslavia was not a part of the Soviet bloc. Yugoslavia and Albania were two countries in Europe, both of them in Southeast Europe, that at different times broke with the dominance of the Soviet Union and sought their own paths within the general field of Marxism and communism. In Yugoslavia, the path that was taken was a search for the so-called third way, something that was in between, and that they hoped combined the best qualities of what was thought of as the Eastern and the Western systems. And one of the things that this meant was that throughout the period of state socialism, compared to other states with state socialist regimes, Yugoslavia was much more open to cultural movements from the so-called West, to artistic movements in film and so on. This is something that is documented in detail by the historian Radina Vucetic in her book Coca-Cola Socialism, where she talks about the ways in which movements, many of them popular, but also some of them radical, from Western Europe, from North America, were brought into the Yugoslav popular culture and adopted and came to serve as a sign of openness. But at the same time, there were limitations to this openness. Yugoslavia was open to Western culture that was critical of the Western system of capitalism and what was viewed as imperialism and so on, but was not open to, in particular, domestic culture that was critical of the system that existed, or was to a very limited extent. But one of the things that this meant is that Yugoslavia played this intermediary role during the Cold War period as kind of the source of Western culture for people in the East, the place where people could go without without leaving the state socialist world and still have access to things like French and German films, like American popular music and so on. Now, when the state socialist period ends in the 1990s, you have a retreat of this position of a retreat from the position of openness. You have a reassertion of indicators of nationality, identity, ethnicity in culture. So there's an explosion of cultural production that can largely be thought of as a rejection of values and priorities that were promoted during the period of state socialism. One of the places that you can see this is a lot of the film production in Yugoslavia were films mythologizing the partisan struggle in the Second World War, the struggle against the occupiers. You saw reinterpretations of the meaning of the Second World War and of movements in the Second World War, movements in which films in which the collaborationist movements of that period are presented as patriotic movements and so on, and that is ongoing. Second, in culture, as opposed to the emphasis on unity and shared identity that was stressed during the period of state socialism, you see an emphasis on indicators of cultural difference, on indicators of distinct understandings of history, on distinct uses of language, on distinct religions. And together with this, remember, this is a period in which conflict between the constituent parts of what had been Yugoslavia was developing and eventually exploded into violence, much of which was justified in national and ethnic terms. You had the development of a whole set of culture of national kitsch, songs mobilizing people to war, expressing resentments between different groups, celebrating one group and denigrating another. In music, this is classified as the period of war folk. I'll give you some examples of war folk that you can look at in video as supplements to this presentation. At the same time, you see the sidelining of things like this underground rock and roll culture that had developed in Yugoslavia in the 1980s, a kind of explosion of creativity that disappeared when the urban markets in which the audiences for this style of music were put into isolation from one another by the establishment of new borders, and the space then for commercial and popular music was taken up by this style called turbo folk. We've said a little bit about turbo folk, and I will give you some examples of turbo folk that you can look at. This is a style based on a kind of popular glamorous style of dance music with some elements increasingly less recognizable of folk music. I mean, what makes turbo folk folk is not the style of music, but the audience to which it appeals. But these are images not of political mobilization, but of glamour, images designed to tell people that the life that they were living was the most perfect and best and most desirable life possible. And at the same time, then, that you see this reassertion of the national and of national division and of national intolerance through popular culture, you see this strong revulsion to what's being promoted in the 1990s and continues to be promoted, in particular among parts of the urban population for whom all of these representations of imaginary identity, of national glory, of glamour, of commercialized sexuality taken together, come to be understood as the symbol of everything that is evil in the society, so that cheap and kitschy popular culture comes to be associated with cheap and kitschy politics, which comes to be associated with violence, which comes to be associated with the debasement of the culture. That is, that popular culture became the lens through which people explained the conditions that they were living in, with which they were not satisfied, and the dominance of cultural space by, for example, the availability of only turbo folk music in coffee shops and so on, becomes understood as a reflection of the relations of dominance in other fields. If you're able to dominate the cultural space, this is only because you're dominating the political space, the economic space, and other spaces of inequality and power in the society.